Imagine waking up one morning and the first thing you notice is that the lights won't turn on. You go to check your phone, but it's completely dead, and the usual buzz of the internet is nowhere to be found. Your TV doesn't work, the radio is silent, and you can't even find any connection to the outside world. No emails, no news updates, and no social media posts. It's a nightmare scenario that sounds almost impossible, but what if it actually happened? What if all of the world's electricity just shut off overnight? The truth is, we're so used to the constant hum of modern technology that we rarely stop to think about what would happen if it suddenly disappeared. The world runs on electricity. From the lights in our homes to the traffic lights on our streets, to the devices we use every day. Almost everything we rely on depends on electricity, and if it suddenly stopped, chaos would set in very quickly. In the first moments, it might seem like a temporary glitch, maybe a power surge or an unexpected outage that'll be fixed by morning, but as hours turn into the day, it will become clear that this isn't a simple issue. Imagine the panic that would spread as people realize that it's not just one neighborhood or one city or even one country. It's the whole world. Every single electrical grid has gone offline, and no one knows why or when it will come back. Now, the initial concern would be something simple. How do we stay warm or cool depending on where you live? Without power, heating systems and air conditioning would stop working, making homes uncomfortable or even dangerous. And that's just the beginning. Everything we use to stay connected, informed, or entertained is powered by electricity. Without it, we would be cut off from each other, left in the dark both literally and figuratively. Phones, radios, and the internet wouldn't work, and we wouldn't be able to access news or even communicate with people outside our immediate area. The world would feel as if it suddenly shrunk, leaving people isolated and vulnerable. The ripple effect of losing electricity would spread far beyond just our homes. Water treatment plants rely heavily on power to filter and pump water. Without it, millions would lose access to clean drinking water, putting communities at serious risk of disease and dehydration. Hospitals, emergency services, and other critical infrastructure would be crippled. No electricity means no functioning medical equipment, and no power for the staff that keep them running. Ambulances wouldn't be able to respond to calls, and first responders would be stretched thin with little to no resources at their disposal. Things would escalate fast. As hours pass without power, things would begin to take a more serious turn. The quiet panic that started to spread early on would grow into full-blown confusion and frustration. Without electricity, we'd begin to notice how much we truly depend on it for everyday life. For example, our food supply chains would be hit hard. Refrigeration and freezing are essential for keeping food from spoiling, but without power, food in grocery stores, warehouses, and homes would start to go bad quickly. What seemed like a temporary inconvenience could soon turn into a life-threatening situation as people scrambled to find ways to preserve food or secure fresh supplies. The transportation systems, which are vital to keep cities running, would also come to a halt. Without power, trains, subways, and buses wouldn't run. Traffic lights would stop working, turning major intersections into chaotic, potentially deadly gridlocks. Drivers would be forced to make their way through a maze of stalled vehicles and confusion. Air travel would be grounded as well, as airports depend on electricity to operate everything from check-in counters to the flight control systems. With the whole world's transportation network shut down, getting goods and people from one place to another would become almost impossible. Communities would start to notice the lack of communication. Without access to the internet or phones, people wouldn't be able to share information or coordinate with others. In larger cities, this could cause significant problems. Residents isolated from loved ones wouldn't know if their families were okay, and first responders would have no way to call for backup or relay crucial information. Those who had been planning to head out of town for vacation, business, or emergencies would find themselves stuck as no forms of travel or transportation were working. Plans and routines that relied on the steady flow of electricity would come to a halt, and life would quickly shift from what we know to a more primitive form of survival. Meanwhile, the simple conveniences that we once took for granted would be gone. No air conditioning on a hot day, no heaters in the middle of winter, and no ability to power essential devices like phones or laptops. People would be forced to rely on other means of communication like handwritten notes, while basic utilities like hot water would be out of reach. Over the next several days, many would struggle to adjust. As temperatures dropped or soared, depending on where you live, staying comfortable would become an increasing challenge. And while this might be uncomfortable for some, it would be far more dangerous for those with medical conditions that require electric-powered equipment, like ventilators. People who are already vulnerable in society, including the elderly and those with limited mobility, would be at risk of serious health issues or even death. As time stretched on without electricity, it would become clear that things would not return to normal anytime soon. In the first few days, people would hold on to hope, believing the outage was just temporary. But as that hope began to fade, the mood would turn darker. People might begin to panic or even resort to desperate measures as their access to food, water, and medicine dwindles. The systems that were put in place to keep societies functioning would start to collapse one by one. With no power to manage them, water treatment plants would stop working. Communication would be cut off, and hospitals would quickly become overwhelmed with patients unable to receive proper care. People would have to adapt, but the clock would be ticking and the sense of chaos would continue to build. As the days turn into weeks, the true consequences of a world without electricity would become even more apparent. The initial shock of the outage would give way to a harsher reality, one that would force people to adapt to a new, unfamiliar way of life. With no power, the conveniences we've grown so accustomed to, like the internet, television, and modern forms of entertainment, would vanish. People would have no choice but to go back to older forms of entertainment, like reading books, playing board games, or engaging in face-to-face conversations. However, with no electricity, the sense of isolation would grow stronger. People would struggle to find ways to pass the time, and in places where food supplies were running low, there would be fewer options for people to maintain their physical and mental health. Yet, during this time, one of the most significant challenges people would face is the lack of clean drinking water. Without power, water treatment plants would shut down, leaving millions of people without access to the clean water they rely on for survival. At first, people might try to use bottled water, but once stores run out, the situation would worsen. In many areas, people would have to resort to finding alternative water sources, such as rivers, lakes, or even rainwater, but this would carry its own set of risks. Contaminated water could lead to widespread illnesses, and access to clean water would quickly become one of the most sought-after resources. Communities would begin to organize to find safe ways to collect and distribute water, but it wouldn't take long before tensions started to rise, as the race for this essential resource grew more desperate. In major cities, the lack of power would bring more severe problems. People would still need to go to work, and businesses would still need to open. But without electricity, the usual systems for managing these operations would break down. Offices, stores, and factories would be forced to close, resulting in lost income and widespread economic turmoil. The global economy would grind to a halt, leaving people without the resources they rely on for daily life. The financial consequences would be devastating, and without power, it would be impossible to conduct business as usual. People would start to realize that this wasn't just a temporary inconvenience, but a shift in the very fabric of society. One of the most significant challenges people would face in a world without electricity would be the loss of medical services. Hospitals depend on power for life-saving equipment like ventilators, dialysis machines, and incubators. Without electricity, many of these essential services would be rendered useless, putting countless lives at risk. People who rely on electric-powered medical devices would find themselves in a critical situation. The healthcare system would be overwhelmed, and with no way to communicate with doctors or hospitals, many would have to rely on their own survival instincts to stay alive. The absence of power would also lead to an increase in medical emergencies, as people living with chronic conditions would be unable to get the treatment they need. As the weeks go by, some communities might start to come together to survive. People would share resources and rely on each other more heavily. It's likely that neighborhoods would bond in ways that we haven't seen in modern times, as people look out for each other and do what they can to make it through. However, as the days wear on, the lack of resources would create tension, food would become increasingly scarce, and the social order we take for granted would begin to erode. As desperation set in, some would resort to violence, looting, or taking extreme measures just to survive. Those with means or resources might try to leave for safer places, but the lack of transportation would make this nearly impossible. Communities would begin to form factions, and the social fabric that we've worked so hard to create would start to fray. With each passing day, the reality of life without electricity would force people to rethink what's truly important. Basic survival would take precedence, and long-term plans would be put on hold. People would focus on finding food, clean water, and shelter, and they would begin to understand just how fragile the systems we rely on are. But this situation would also lead to an opportunity for growth. As people adjusted to this new life, there would be a return to simpler times, a time when people relied on their resourcefulness and communities to survive. There would be a chance to rediscover skills and strengths that modern life has made us forget. But no matter how people adapted, the world would never be the same. The loss of electricity would be a reminder of just how dependent we've become on technology and how vulnerable we are when that technology disappears. As the months roll on, the situation in a world without electricity would become even more dire. By now, the novelty of a life disconnected from technology would wear off, and people would begin to realize the long-term implications of living in such a drastically altered world. Food supplies would continue to dwindle, and people would be forced to rely on whatever they could grow, hunt, or scavenge. This would lead to the rise of small, self-sustaining communities that would focus on agriculture, bartering, and survival skills. Some people might have learned how to grow their own crops, while others might have turned to hunting or fishing to make ends meet. But the reality is that without electricity, our agricultural systems would break down, making it harder and harder to produce enough food to sustain the population. The lack of electricity would also lead to an energy crisis, with people scrambling to find ways to generate power. Solar panels, wind turbines, and other renewable energy sources would become essential for survival, but not everyone would have access to them. Those who lived in rural areas or had the means to set up off-grid systems might have an advantage, but for most people, power generation would still be an issue. This would be especially challenging for those who live in urban areas, where the infrastructure is designed to rely on a constant flow of electricity. Urban centers without power would become ghost towns as people moved out in search of food, water, and a way to survive. As the world continued to adjust to the new normal, the breakdown of society would take a toll on mental health. People would struggle with the psychological effects of living in a world without the conveniences and comforts of modern life. Anxiety, depression, and despair would become more common, and without the ability to connect with others through technology, many would feel isolated and alone. People might try to organize in small groups for emotional support, but the constant stress of survival would wear people down. As time passed, the very essence of human civilization would change. Communities would become more insular, and the concept of trust would be redefined. In a world without electricity, every day would be a fight for survival, and it would take everything people had to keep going. At this point, the idea of restoring power would become a distant hope. People would still wonder if electricity would ever come back, but as the years dragged on, the chances of that happening would become slimmer. Governments and large organizations would struggle to get the systems back up and running, and the complexity of rebuilding power grids, communication systems, and infrastructure would be a massive undertaking. The financial and human resources required to restore everything would be nearly impossible to gather in the absence of a functioning economy. The global population would shrink and society would regress, reverting to simpler ways of life that rely on the most basic human skills: farming, hunting, and cooperation. But even in the face of such devastation, humans would find a way to adapt. Over time, society would rebuild itself from the ground up. The loss of electricity would force humanity to rediscover the importance of community, resourcefulness, and sustainability. The survivors of this new world would create new systems, new ways of living, and a new understanding of how to thrive without the technology that once defined their lives. But it would be a hard road ahead, one where every day would require a reminder of how much we took for granted in the world we once knew. It would be a world in which the need for electricity is no longer a convenience but a distant memory, a world where survival would take precedence and the lessons learned from this global catastrophe would change humanity forever. And in that future, the question would still linger: would we be able to build a better world from the ashes of the old one? Or would we fall back into the same patterns of over-reliance on technology, forgetting the lessons of the blackout that nearly destroyed civilization? One thing is certain: the world without electricity would forever change the way we see the world and the way we live in it. The story of this new world would be one of resilience, struggle, and the enduring human spirit. It would be a world where survival is the only thing that matters and where humanity would learn the true meaning of self-sufficiency. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 2025, and suddenly your phone has no signal, your Wi-Fi is down, and the power in your entire neighborhood has vanished. Not just your town or your city. Millions of people are in the same situation all over the world. This isn't the result of a power plant issue or a cyber attack. This is a full-blown solar superstorm, erupting with the same strength as the Carrington Event from the year 1859, but happening today. Let's be clear, this is a hypothetical scenario, but it's one based on very real science. The Carrington Event was the most powerful solar storm ever recorded. Back then, it lit up the skies with bright auroras and even set telegraph systems on fire. Now imagine that same level of solar activity slamming into a world that relies on satellites, GPS, internet, and massive interconnected power grids. It's not just a science fiction idea, it's something experts say is possible and maybe even overdue. The sun goes through an 11-year cycle of solar activity. Some years are quiet, while others are loaded with flares and sunspots. During active periods, the sun can launch what's called a coronal mass ejection, or CME. That's when a huge bubble of charged particles and magnetic energy blasts out into space. If the timing and direction are just right, or just wrong, depending how you look at it, it can hit Earth straight on, and that's exactly what happened in 1859. But back then, people didn't have smartphones, air traffic control, or millions of miles of high-voltage power lines. All they had were basic electrical systems, mostly telegraph lines, and even those were fried. Some operators reported electric shocks from their equipment. Now fast forward to today, everything from planes to hospitals to stock markets depends on systems that are much more sensitive. If a Carrington-level solar storm hit today, we wouldn't just see pretty lights in the sky. In the very first hours, the Earth's magnetic field would go into chaos, power grids would be slammed with unexpected electrical currents. Transformers could overheat and explode. High-frequency radio used by aircraft and ships might completely drop out. We could lose access to GPS signals, which are used by everything from delivery services to farming equipment. Even oil pipelines could be affected, with pressure and flow data going haywire due to false readings caused by magnetic interference. Satellites would be one of the first to suffer. The intense radiation could fry circuits and knock out communication satellites and weather monitoring systems. The International Space Station might have to power down or shift to a safe mode. All the services that rely on satellites, navigation, television, phone calls, internet, banking could fail within minutes. And this isn't something that would only affect one part of the world. This would be a global problem. That's what makes this scenario so scary. It's not a localized disaster, it's worldwide. And here's where it gets even more serious. The warning time would be very short. Scientists might only have 12 to 18 hours from detecting a major solar flare to the arrival of the charged particles on Earth. That doesn't give much time for governments or energy companies to shut down and protect sensitive systems. There are alert systems in place, like those run by NASA and the NOAA in the United States, but they can only do so much. Once the storm is on its way, there's no stopping it. So what would those first 24 hours look like? Chaos, panic, confusion. People wouldn't be able to contact loved ones, banks could shut down, emergency services might have trouble coordinating, traffic lights would go dark, air traffic control could lose radar, flights might be grounded, and this is just the beginning. The world isn't prepared for a solar event like the one that happened over 160 years ago. Back then, the worst that happened was some sparks and confusion. Today, a storm of that size would hit every part of our lives all at once with very little warning. That's just the beginning of what a Carrington-level event could do in the modern world. The real damage would unfold in the days and weeks that follow, as we'll see next. As the first day of the solar superstorm wraps up, the immediate effects are already devastating. With satellites and communication systems down, the next few hours become a critical time. Power grids, already overloaded with geomagnetically induced currents, begin to fail in large parts of the world. Some areas experience total blackouts, while others deal with rolling outages that could stretch on for weeks, depending on the severity of the damage. And it's not just the power. Transportation systems are in disarray. Without GPS signals, planes are grounded, ships can't navigate, and trains come to a halt. The chaos isn't confined to just the electrical and communications networks. The impact is felt across almost every industry. Hospitals struggle to function as backup power systems are quickly depleted. Medical equipment, heavily reliant on electricity, goes offline, and critical systems for monitoring patient health and administering treatment falter. The consequences for healthcare could be severe, with urgent care centers unable to access patient records, or worse, unable to assist patients in emergency situations. People in need of life-saving procedures would find themselves at the mercy of an overwhelmed system that's barely hanging on. The financial markets are among the hardest hit. Global stock exchanges grind to a halt as trading systems collapse, unable to process transactions. In an era of digital financial systems, this could lead to massive disruptions in buying, selling, and investing. The flow of money would cease, causing panic, particularly in the banking sector. People would rush to ATMs to withdraw cash, but the machines might not work, leaving many with no access to their funds. While the full economic impact of this solar storm would take time to reveal itself, it's likely that the damage would amount to billions, if not trillions, of dollars. At the same time, the agricultural sector would begin to feel the effects of the storm. Modern farming relies heavily on technology, whether it's GPS-guided machinery for planting and harvesting crops or automated systems for managing irrigation. Without those systems functioning, the efficiency of farming operations would drop dramatically. Farmers might find themselves unable to plant or harvest crops on time, leading to food shortages. Supply chains would struggle to keep up with demand, making it difficult to move food from farms to grocery stores, which would increase prices and possibly trigger widespread panic buying. Basic necessities like food, water, and fuel would quickly become scarce in many places. The consequences would be felt around the world. Nations relying on international trade for vital resources would find themselves unable to import or export goods. In the United States alone, the Department of Energy estimates that a major solar storm could knock out a large portion of the country's electrical grid for a period of months, if not longer. And because many of the transformers that power these grids take months or even years to replace, recovery would be slow and painful. The real danger of a Carrington-level solar storm is that it isn't just an event that passes over. The disruptions caused by the initial impact could stretch into weeks, months, and even years. As industries and infrastructure struggle to recover, society would be forced to adapt. People would have to figure out how to function without the conveniences they rely on every day, from smartphones to online banking. Food shortages could become more severe, and access to clean waters might become a challenge in regions where treatment plants are affected by power failures. The environmental impact of the solar storm would also be significant. Satellite-based weather monitoring systems would be down, making it harder to predict and prepare for other natural disasters, like hurricanes or wildfires. The inability to monitor the atmosphere could lead to unexpected environmental damage, further compounding the challenges of survival in a post-superstorm world. As we move into the following days, the initial chaos from the solar storm continues to unfold. The world is not prepared for something of this scale, and people start to realize just how fragile our reliance on technology truly is. But this is only the beginning. The ripple effects of a solar storm like this would continue to affect every part of life, and the true extent of the damage wouldn't be clear for weeks, months, or even longer. The recovery process, once it begins, will be far from simple. It will take coordination, innovation, and a major effort to rebuild the systems we've come to rely on so heavily. In the next part, we'll look into what happens when the dust settles and how the world would attempt to recover. As the days pass after the solar superstorm, the damage continues to unfold. The initial panic has begun to settle, but the long-term effects of the event are now becoming painfully apparent. Communities are still grappling with widespread power outages. While some parts of the world may have managed to restore basic electricity, entire regions remain without power. The cost to repair the electrical grids is astronomical, and the lack of trained personnel and equipment to replace destroyed transformers only adds to the delay. In some areas, it's estimated that it could take years to fully restore power, leaving entire populations to live without the conveniences of modern life. With the electricity still a scarce commodity, many of the world's technological systems remain compromised. Communication networks reliant on satellite connections remain largely offline. While some ground-based systems may have been partially restored, most of the world's cell towers and internet connections are still out of commission. In the absence of reliable communication, communities turn to more primitive methods, like radio broadcasts, to stay informed. However, even these become increasingly difficult to maintain as resources, including fuel for generators, grow thinner. The loss of global connectivity means that people feel more isolated, with a growing divide between those who still have access to information and those who do not. Transportation continues to struggle. Without GPS, air travel is severely hindered. Commercial flights are grounded, and air traffic control systems remain overwhelmed by the backlog of canceled flights. With no reliable way of navigating, airports become chaotic hubs, as people are stranded and unsure when they can return to their homes or reach other destinations. The already stressed transportation system begins to falter under the weight of the crisis. Ground transportation, like trains and buses, also face interruptions due to electrical failures. Some vehicles that rely on electric systems simply stop working. and the lack of fuel due to distribution issues only exacerbates the problem. The agricultural sector, which initially faced struggles, now begins to show signs of collapse in some regions. Fields lie fallow, crops are lost, and the logistical nightmare of delivering food becomes even more critical. While some food production has been salvaged by local farming operations that are more self-sustaining, the global supply chain continues to suffer. The economy of many nations takes a severe hit as businesses shut down or reduce their operations due to the lack of communication and energy to power their production lines. The loss of critical infrastructure means that industries that rely on just-in-time supply chains, like manufacturing, can't keep up with demand, which affects everything from electronics to clothing to car parts. Even in areas with food, prices soar as supply becomes strained and the demand for basic goods increases. Meanwhile, healthcare systems remain under incredible strain. Hospitals, still reeling from the initial failure of medical devices and power outages, struggle to provide care. Emergency medical equipment like ventilators and dialysis machines, which are dependent on a constant electricity supply, are still inoperable in many places. The ripple effect continues to affect people's health with delayed treatments and surgeries. People with chronic conditions are at risk, and the long-term effects on health will compound the crisis in the months ahead. Medical professionals are overwhelmed, and many struggle with the added pressure of not being able to rely on technology that once helped save lives. The social implications of the solar storm become more pronounced as well. As time goes on, people begin to experience more tension and frustration with each passing day. Basic services are disrupted, leading to growing unrest in some parts of the world. Food riots break out in urban areas where access to necessities is most limited. Communities that are already facing socioeconomic challenges are hit the hardest. The divide between the rich and the poor grows wider, with wealthier areas able to secure limited resources while poorer ones face increasing scarcity. In addition to the human cost, the environment also feels the long-term consequences of the solar superstorm. With satellites still down, scientists are unable to monitor weather systems as effectively as they once could. This lack of data leads to significant challenges in forecasting natural disasters. Floods, hurricanes, and wildfires, which were once more predictable, now pose an even greater threat. Without satellite monitoring, predicting the movement and intensity of storms becomes a game of chance. This leads to a lack of preparation and, in some cases, devastating losses when natural disasters hit unexpectedly. The global economy is also starting to unravel. Trade, which relies heavily on digital communication, remains at a standstill. International businesses struggle to manage logistics without reliable systems in place, and governments scramble to fill the gaps. Banks, which rely on digital records for processing transactions, face crippling delays. As stock markets continue to fluctuate and trade disruptions affect companies worldwide, the full economic impact of this solar storm is becoming clearer. Economists predict that the global economy could shrink by a staggering amount, with losses reaching trillions of dollars. While the initial chaos of the event has calmed somewhat, the lasting effects are only beginning to be felt. Recovery will take years, if not decades, and the world will have to adapt to a new reality, one where the reliance on technology that once seemed invulnerable is now seen as fragile and vulnerable. Societies will have to rethink how they interact with the digital world and rebuild the systems that make life possible in the modern age. But even as recovery efforts begin, the question remains: when will the next Carrington-level solar superstorm strike? And will we be any more prepared the next time it happens? The lessons learned from this event could be our only hope for safeguarding the future. As the world continues to recover from the devastating effects of the solar superstorm, it becomes clear that the long-term repercussions will be felt for generations. The rebuilding process is slow, and many systems that once seemed invincible are now being reevaluated. One of the most immediate challenges in the aftermath of the storm is the worldwide push to adapt and fortify infrastructure against future solar activity. Governments, industries, and scientists have come together in a global effort to ensure that, if a similar event were to happen again, humanity is better prepared. The first steps in this rebuilding effort are focused on strengthening power grids. Engineers work tirelessly to create more resilient electrical systems that can better withstand geomagnetic storms. The process is costly, with some estimates suggesting that billions of dollars will be spent on upgrading grid infrastructure. A focus is placed on replacing outdated transformers with more advanced models capable of handling the surge of energy that a solar storm could cause. Additionally, there is growing investment in the development of backup systems that can keep critical facilities running in the event of power outages, such as hospitals and emergency services. While progress is being made, many experts warn that it will take decades before the global electrical grid can be fully fortified against the threat of a solar superstorm. In the space sector, lessons learned from the disruption to satellite systems are driving innovation. The vulnerability of communication satellites to radiation damage is now a major concern. The industry has already begun to focus on creating more robust and radiation-resistant satellites. These new satellites will feature enhanced shielding and the ability to recover from temporary outages caused by solar storms. However, it's not just about strengthening the satellites themselves. More attention is now being given to creating better early warning systems that can predict solar activity and provide enough time for satellites to be put into protective modes before being hit by solar flares. This could help prevent complete system failures and reduce the amount of time it takes to restore communication networks after a solar storm. On the ground, communities that were hit hardest by the solar storm continue to rebuild, but many face significant challenges. Rural areas that were disconnected from the global network for months or even years have started to focus on more localized energy solutions, like solar panels and wind turbines, to reduce their reliance on the vulnerable power grid. However, implementing these systems on a large scale is expensive and requires the support of governments and businesses to ensure that renewable energy becomes a viable option for communities in need. The reality is that without these alternative power solutions, many areas could remain at the mercy of solar activity for years to come. As time goes on, social and political dynamics also change. Many governments now place more emphasis on disaster preparedness, with the realization that technological infrastructure must be made more resilient to the increasing frequency of space weather events. In some regions, emergency response systems are being overhauled, and plans are put in place to ensure that people can stay informed during future disasters. There is a growing recognition that the fragility of modern systems means that societal structures could break down in the face of widespread disruption, and thus new frameworks must be established to deal with such crises. The economic recovery remains slow. Supply chains that rely on precise timing and digital systems still struggle to return to full functionality. While some industries have managed to adapt to the new reality, others face ongoing difficulties. The global economy, once highly interconnected and reliant on advanced technology, is now operating in a more fragmented way. This shift has led to greater self-sufficiency in some countries, while others face increasing isolation. The lack of global coordination has been one of the most significant setbacks in recovery efforts, as nations work at their own pace to rebuild what was lost. The impact of the solar superstorm also brings about a cultural shift. People, once accustomed to instant communication and constant digital connectivity, now have a deeper understanding of the vulnerabilities of their technology. There's a growing awareness of how dependent society has become on systems that, in many ways, were never designed to withstand the force of a natural event like a solar storm. In many places, communities have started to rethink how they engage with technology, with some even returning to older methods of communication and transportation. People become more focused on local and sustainable living, trying to become less reliant on the global system that, in a single moment, can fail them. Looking forward, researchers continue to study solar activity, hoping to gain a better understanding of the sun's behavior and develop more accurate prediction models. While the next Carrington-level event could be centuries away or right around the corner, the global community has learned valuable lessons from the last disaster. In a world where technology is so deeply integrated into our daily lives, the importance of preparedness cannot be overstated. The recovery from a solar superstorm, like the one we just experienced, may take years, but with each lesson learned, humanity grows stronger and more resilient in the face of natural events that we can only begin to understand. As we move forward, we'll carry the knowledge that the next solar storm is just as unpredictable as the one we've just lived through, and we must be ready for it. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 2025, turning on the news and seeing a breaking story on every channel. All flights grounded worldwide. No planes are flying, and they won't be coming back. At first, people might assume it's some sort of temporary issue, maybe a glitch or an international emergency, but as the hours pass, it becomes clear, if you see, this is permanent. Every airport, runway, and and control tower around the globe is suddenly useless. The skies are silent. No takeoffs, no landings. For the first time in over 100 years, the air above us is empty. This would feel like something straight out of a movie. Over 100,000 commercial flights operate every single day, moving everything from passengers to fresh seafood to urgent medical supplies. Planes connect people across continents in just a few hours. Without them, the world would suddenly feel much larger and more isolated. Families separated by oceans would be cut off, unable to visit one another without long and difficult alternatives. Business trips would be canceled, honeymoons and vacations would vanish overnight. Some people would wake up in countries they had only planned to visit for a weekend, now stuck indefinitely. Airports, once buzzing with life, would fall quiet. Inside terminals, chaos would begin as travelers realized there's no way out. Tens of thousands of people would be stranded in cities far from home. Flight boards would be frozen in place, showing delays and cancellations for every single destination. Taxi lines would overflow, hotel lobbies would crowd up fast, and people would scramble to book trains or buses, anything to keep moving. But for many, especially those on islands or in countries without connected rail systems, there'd be no real option left. And then comes the confusion. Airline workers wouldn't know what to tell passengers. Pilots and flight crews would be grounded without warning. And air traffic controllers would suddenly be out of a job. There would be no official playbook for something like this. This level of shutdown has never happened, not even during global events like September 11th or the early days of the COVID pandemic. This would be the first time in modern history that all flight just stopped and never resumed. The air would be strangely quiet too. No distant hum of jets overhead, no contrails streaking the sky. For people living near busy airports, it might even feel eerie at first. A kind of silence the world has never really known. But behind that quiet comes tension. People would be glued to their phones and TVs, waiting for some kind of update, an announcement, anything to explain how this happened, but none would come. Planes are simply done flying forever, and this is just the beginning. The real trouble starts when the effects begin to ripple out into every corner of everyday life, not just for travelers, but for industries, governments, and the global economy. The first few hours would bring confusion and panic, but the next few days would bring much more than that. After the initial shock wears off, the deeper consequences of a world without air travel begin to show. One of the first areas to feel the strain would be cargo and freight. While many people think of planes mainly in terms of passengers, a huge portion of global goods move through the skies every day. High-value items like electronics, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment are often shipped by air because it's fast and secure. Without flights, these supply chains would break instantly. In just a few days, hospitals in remote areas would run low on specialized medicine that is usually flown in. Certain organ transplants, which rely on fast delivery by air, would no longer be possible. Temperature-sensitive goods like insulin, vaccines, or blood plasma would be nearly impossible to transport across countries in time. Cold storage trucking can only cover so much ground, and not every region has the infrastructure for long-distance road shipping. The tech industry would also be hit hard. Many companies move critical parts for phones, computers, and servers by air. When those shipments stop, production lines start to slow down or even shut off completely. Factories that depend on just-in-time delivery methods would not have enough storage or backup supplies to keep running for long. This would lead to shortages on the store shelves and delays in shipping new devices across the world. Postal systems would grind to a crawl. International mail would have to travel by sea, which takes weeks instead of hours. Things like overnight documents, time-sensitive legal papers, or international business contracts could no longer be delivered on time. E-commerce would feel the pressure too. Global online retailers often use air freight to move products quickly between warehouses and customers. But without that option, delivery times would stretch out dramatically, from 2 days to 2 weeks or more. Then there's the issue of perishables. Many countries rely on imported fresh food that is flown in daily. Exotic fruits, fresh fish, specialty meats, and even flowers would disappear from markets. Grocery stores in landlocked nations or those with poor road and rail systems would be forced to switch to only local food. Prices would go up fast, and selection would shrink even faster. For places like small islands that import most of their fresh produce by air, this could lead to food insecurity in a matter of weeks. The ripple effects don't stop at just goods and services. Insurance companies would suddenly face massive claims from canceled cargo shipments installed contracts. Legal disputes over delivery guarantees would clog court systems. Even museums and art galleries would be affected, since they often rely on air transport for moving exhibits and priceless works of art. That entire system would be shut down. Meanwhile, ports and railway systems would be pushed to their limits. As demand shifts to sea and land freight, there would be huge backlogs at shipping yards. Trains and trucks could not handle a sudden overload, especially in countries where infrastructure is already stretched thin. Delays would stack up fast, and smaller businesses would be the first to feel the hit. And all of this would only be in the first couple of weeks. The world would still be trying to figure out what long-term life looks like without flight, and not everyone would be able to adapt. By the time a month has passed, the effects of a world with no air travel would begin to reshape everyday life in ways most people never expected. One of the biggest changes would be in how people view distance. What used to be a simple 4-hour flight now becomes a multi-day journey by car, bus, or train, if that route even exists. Long-distance relationships would suffer. International families would be cut off, not by borders, but by the sheer difficulty of getting from one place to another. Even a visit between neighboring countries could become a major undertaking. The travel industry as a whole would be in shambles. Airlines would be permanently shut down. Entire fleets of planes would sit rusting in unused airports. Thousands of pilots, flight attendants, and ground crews would be out of work with no jobs to return to. The tourism industry would be decimated. Places that once relied on travelers, from Paris to Bali to New York City, would see hotels shut down, local businesses close, and unemployment skyrocket. Cruise lines and train operators would try to fill the gap, but they could never match the global reach or speed of air travel. In the academic world, international student exchange programs would disappear. Universities that relied on students flying in from overseas would face budget cuts and shrinking enrollment. Global conferences, once held in big cities and attended by experts from all over the world, would have to move online permanently or be limited to local participants. Scientific collaboration would slow down, with researchers no longer able to attend labs or events outside their region. Sports would also take a major hit. International competitions, like the Olympics or the World Cup, would be nearly impossible to organize. Teams could not fly to play in different countries, and fans could not travel to see them. Even national leagues that spanned across large countries, like in the United States, Russia, or Brazil, would struggle to maintain schedules. Entire seasons might be canceled or severely reduced to only local matchups. Diplomacy would look different too. Government leaders and diplomats would no longer be able to hop on a plane for emergency meetings or peace talks. Embassies might become more important again, with foreign affairs managed more slowly through written communication and digital calls. Political tension could grow as misunderstandings drag on and in-person meetings become rare. Countries that once relied on fast air travel to respond to disasters or humanitarian crises would be forced to rethink how they provide aid or manage emergencies abroad. Even the way we experience global culture would shift. People would not be able to visit different countries and see the world for themselves. Travel documentaries and social media influencers who built careers around visiting far-off places would become a thing of the past. Without the ability to travel quickly, people would grow up never leaving their region, and global culture might begin to fracture. The sense of shared international identity could weaken, with communities becoming more focused on local or national concerns. The skies, once filled with movement and noise, would remain permanently empty. And while some would enjoy the peace and the cleaner air, the world as a whole would feel smaller, slower, and more isolated than ever before. A world without flight would no longer be the connected place we once knew, and that realization would just be sinking in as people try to move forward. As the years go by in a world without planes, the long-term changes would start to settle in. One of the biggest shifts would be in how countries and businesses redesign their transportation systems. Governments would invest heavily in high-speed rail, long-distance highways, and shipping routes. Trains that cross continents would become the new norm, with efforts to connect major cities through land rather than air. Ferries and cargo ships would increase in use even for passenger travel, though much slower than flying ever was. Logistics companies would have to rework how goods are moved. In the past, a shipment from Japan to the United Kingdom might have taken just 2 days by air. Now it could take over a month by sea and land. This would force companies to store more inventory in advance and rely less on quick turnarounds. Food chains that once served fresh produce flown in from tropical countries would now rely only on what can be grown locally or shipped without spoiling. Supermarkets would look different, and menus at restaurants would lose many items people used to take for granted. The tech world would also evolve. With international travel off the table, companies would focus more on improving virtual communication. Remote work and virtual meetings would become permanent fixtures. Technologies like virtual reality and holograms could see a surge in development, aiming to make people feel more present during digital meetings and events. Students and professionals might attend lectures, workshops, or conferences through immersive digital platforms rather than boarding a plane. Airports would be left behind like relics of a faster past. Once busy terminals would be abandoned or turned into other facilities, maybe shopping centers, housing developments, or museums. The iconic sound of jet engines would vanish from daily life. Kids growing up in this new world might never hear a plane overhead or understand what it was like to fly across the ocean in a single day. Entire generations would be raised without ever stepping foot in an airplane. Climate change would become a central topic in this new chapter. With aviation gone, global carbon emissions would see a noticeable drop, especially in the first few years. Environmental groups would push for more reductions in other areas, arguing that if the world could give up planes, maybe it could give up other polluting habits too. On the other hand, industries forced to rely on slower, dirtier cargo ships and longer truck routes might cancel out some of those gains. It would spark debate over what the world truly gained or lost by letting go of flight. In time, humanity would adapt. People would find new ways to connect, trade, and move across the planet, just as they had before airplanes were invented. But the global mindset would be different. The sense that the world was once only hours away from anywhere to anywhere would fade. A flightless world would be one that feels more spread out, slower, and maybe even more fragile. And while some would see this new world as simpler or more grounded, others would always look up at the sky and wonder what was lost. If the internet were to disappear forever, the world would face a disruption of epic proportions. It's hard to imagine a world without the internet, but what if it happened suddenly? No warning, no time to prepare. One day the internet is just gone. It's more than just a convenience for watching videos or checking social media. The internet is woven into nearly every aspect of our lives, from how we work to how we shop, communicate, and even travel. The first few hours would likely be pure confusion. People would notice that their Wi-Fi is down and they'd check their phones to see if it's just them. As they realize that it's not an issue with their devices, panic would start to set in. Those who rely on the internet for work, whether it's remote jobs, communication, or even accessing files stored in the cloud, would immediately hit a wall. Offices would close, workers would be stuck without access to crucial information, and projects would grind to a halt. Without email or the ability to contact colleagues or clients, people would feel completely isolated. But it's not just office workers who would be affected. Most people's daily lives have become entangled with the internet. You wouldn't be able to order food from your favorite restaurant or use apps like Uber or Lyft to get around. Online banking, gone. People would be left wondering how to manage their finances without access to their accounts, or digital payment methods like PayPal or Venmo. Even basic tasks like checking the weather or looking up a phone number would become monumental challenges. For some, the lack of internet would be almost surreal. Schools and universities would shut down. Kids and students who rely on the internet for homework, research, or online learning programs would be left with nothing. Teachers who are accustomed to using the web for lesson plans, research, and classroom materials would find themselves scrambling for alternatives. The educational system would be hit hard, and it would take weeks or even months to reestablish the kinds of systems we rely on for learning. And then there are the emergency services. Hospitals, police stations, and fire departments all rely on the internet for communication, coordination, and patient information. Without access to hospital databases, doctors and nurses could struggle to provide proper care, emergency response teams would be severely hampered, and the lack of communication could lead to delays and confusion during critical moments. In the first few hours, the world would be left with a feeling of collective loss, as if an essential part of modern life has simply vanished. It's easy to take the internet for granted when it's working fine, but without it, the weight of its absence would be felt everywhere. While people would initially try to go about their daily lives, the glaring absence of something that holds everything together would quickly become apparent. As things start to settle in, the world would begin to realize just how dependent we've become on the internet. What happens next is where things would get even more interesting. Would the world find a way to adapt, or would society begin to unravel in unexpected ways? That's where things would really start to get complicated, and the answers wouldn't be clear right away. This was just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next part where we'll dive deeper into the long-term effects of the internet disappearing and how it would affect everything from businesses to personal relationships. As the hours turn into days, the true scale of the internet's disappearance becomes apparent. People start to adjust to the initial shock, but they quickly realize that without the internet, everything is slower, harder, and less efficient. Global communication, once instantaneous, grinds to a halt. Phone lines, once an alternative to email, are now overloaded with calls as businesses try to connect with clients, suppliers, and partners. But without the ability to quickly exchange information, companies struggle to meet deadlines or continue operations. International trade would face a massive blow. Global supply chains rely heavily on the internet for real-time inventory tracking, shipments, and communication between buyers and suppliers across time zones. Without the internet, transportation logistics would break down. Goods would still be moving, but not with the speed and coordination that we've come to expect. This would lead to delays in everything from the manufacturing of products to the delivery of essential goods like medicine, food, and electronics. The financial markets would be another major casualty. Stock exchanges, reliant on the internet for transactions, would come to a standstill. Traders and investors wouldn't be able to make real-time decisions, and without access to financial news, there would be a severe lack of information on market conditions. In fact, it's likely that the markets would crash, at least temporarily, as panic sets in. Digital banking systems would stop, and people's access to their savings, investments, and other financial services would be blocked. This could lead to widespread uncertainty and potentially even economic collapse. The lack of the internet would also expose just how deeply we rely on digital services for healthcare. Hospitals and medical facilities use the internet for everything. From patient records to medical research and telemedicine, doctors and nurses would be unable to access critical health data, potentially putting lives at risk. While hospitals would still function without the internet, the loss of connected systems would drastically affect their ability to provide efficient care. Additionally, the lack of access to online pharmacies and telehealth services would prevent many from receiving the treatments they depend on. Meanwhile, social isolation would become a growing issue. For many, social media and messaging apps are vital for staying connected with friends, family, and loved ones. Without these tools, people would feel cut off from their social circles. While traditional forms of communication, like phone calls and face-to-face meetings, would still exist, the convenience and reach of the internet would no longer be there. People would have to turn to older ways of staying in touch, such as writing letters or making long-distance phone calls, both of which would be far slower and less efficient than what they're used to. The entertainment industry would also struggle. Streaming services, online gaming, and digital media platforms would vanish overnight. People would have to turn back to physical forms of entertainment like DVDs and CDs, but those options are limited in a world where we've been conditioned to get instant access to movies, music, and shows. With live streaming events and social media influencers no longer able to share their content online, many entertainment companies would be forced to adapt quickly, perhaps by returning to more traditional forms of media production and distribution. In the immediate aftermath, people might start turning to alternatives to the internet. For example, offline networks could emerge with individuals creating makeshift communication systems to share information, but these would be inefficient, local, and unsustainable for global-scale problems. In the short term, people might also seek out more in-person activities and interactions, but the reliance on the internet for everything from shopping to education to socializing would create significant gaps in everyday life. As the world continues to adjust, governments would likely have to intervene. They'd need to address the economic and social crises that are unfolding, providing support to businesses, healthcare systems, and individuals who are struggling to adapt. Meanwhile, countries with less advanced infrastructure may face even more severe challenges. Without the internet, the digital divide between rich and poor countries would grow even wider, as wealthier nations have more resources to cope with the loss. The early days without the internet would be chaotic, but the longer it went on, the harder it would be to cope with the loss. In the next part, we'll explore the long-term consequences of a world without the internet and how it could affect everything from education to global politics. Within the first few weeks to a couple of months after the internet disappears forever, the deeper and more complex consequences start to unfold. By now, the initial panic has shifted into confusion and frustration, especially as people realize this is not a temporary outage. Without any sign of it returning, every industry, government, and household has to fully adapt to a world where online access no longer exists. And it's not just about finding alternatives, it's about rebuilding everything. By the third or fourth week, most businesses that relied on cloud computing or web-based tools start to completely shut down. Companies that offered services through apps like food delivery, ride sharing, or online banking have either collapsed or shifted to slower, outdated systems. Employees can no longer work from home unless they're using offline tools, and office life begins to resemble the late 20th century again. Fax machines make a comeback, paper memos are posted on walls, meetings happen face-to-face or through landline conference calls. Some companies just can't keep up, and mass layoffs start happening across multiple sectors. Retail stores begin seeing more foot traffic, but they're overwhelmed. Many of them use the internet for inventory, supply chain tracking, or even basic checkout functions. Without those systems, shelves are disorganized and restocking becomes inconsistent. Cashiers manually enter prices, and long lines become a common part of everyday shopping. Customers are confused, upset, and constantly waiting for a process that used to take just seconds. Meanwhile, governments around the world are under pressure to maintain control and stability. In the absence of online banking, citizens start showing up at physical bank branches in massive numbers, trying to withdraw money or get answers. There are long waits, paper forms, and even rationing of cash in some areas. Countries that had digital-only services like online tax filing or benefits portals have to rapidly shift to phone lines and walk-in offices, creating long delays and frustration. Transportation systems are hit hard too. Airlines that once relied on digital ticketing and scheduling now struggle to operate with handwritten manifests and in-person bookings. Railways and cargo transport lose the ability to track shipments, and some companies stop deliveries altogether. Ports and customs offices can't process goods efficiently without internet-based records. This slows global trade dramatically. Goods pile up at ports and warehouses, and by the second month, certain items like electronics, imported food, and medicine start to disappear from shelves. The world of medicine faces a quiet crisis. Many hospitals had digital records, online appointment systems, and automated prescription tracking. Without those, medical staff revert to paperwork, which takes longer and leads to more mistakes. Pharmacies struggle to confirm prescriptions. Some patients go without their medications for days. Specialized medical knowledge that was once shared quickly online now travels by mail, fax, or courier, creating delays in treatment, especially in rural or remote areas. In schools, students and teachers adjust to new routines. Online learning disappears entirely. Printed materials return and homework is collected in person. Communication with parents happens by phone or paper notes. It's a huge adjustment, especially for older students who relied on digital platforms for assignments, research, and grades. Teachers are stretched thin trying to manage classrooms without any online help, and many schools see lower attendance as parents struggle to balance their own work without digital tools. Media also changes drastically. With no social media or streaming, people turn to television, radio, and newspapers again. But with fewer resources and slower information flow, it's harder to keep people updated on what's happening around the world. Rumors spread faster than facts. People begin to rely more on their communities, local stations, and even word of mouth for news and updates. Some newspapers see a small revival, but they can't compete with the instant updates people were used to before. By the end of the second month, it's clear that this is not just a digital issue. It's a complete reshaping of modern life. What started as confusion has turned into a full cultural and societal reset. The world is slower, more isolated, and more fragile. And for many, the question remains, how do you rebuild a world that depended on something you can't get back? By the time a full year has passed without the internet, the world would look and feel completely different. It wouldn't just be about adjusting to slower ways of working or finding alternatives to streaming movies or ordering food. It would be about living in a world that has lost one of its central systems. Culturally, politically, and globally, life would be reshaped in ways people never expected. Social life would be one of the biggest changes. Without the internet, global connection would fade. Long-distance friendships and family relationships that once survived through video calls, messaging apps, or social media would weaken. People would have to rely on letters, landline calls, or even occasional travel just to keep in touch. For younger generations who grew up with digital communication, this would feel like a major loss of connection to the outside world. In fact, entire generations would start growing up never knowing what it was like to go online. The internet, once so central to everyday life, would become more like a historical era. People would tell stories about it the way older generations talk about rotary phones or black and white television. This shift would also bring changes in identity, entertainment, and how people express themselves. With no social media, people would rely more on face-to-face interaction, writing, or local gatherings to share their ideas, art, or opinions. Politically, the disappearance of the internet would shift power in unexpected ways. Governments that once relied on online platforms for communication, campaigning, or digital voting would have to return to traditional methods. This might sound like a return to simpler times, but it would also leave room for manipulation. With slower news cycles and fewer ways to fact-check claims, people could be more easily swayed by misinformation or propaganda. State-run media would become more powerful in some countries, especially those with strict control over newspapers and television. International relations would also change. Countries that relied heavily on global internet infrastructure, especially for intelligence gathering, communication between allies, and cybersecurity would have to build new systems. Diplomatic talks that once happened through secure online channels would be slowed down. Cyber attacks would no longer be a threat, but new types of threats might emerge. Spying, surveillance, and information wars would evolve into new forms, relying more on physical methods and old-school tactics. The world economy would also keep shifting. Global stock markets, which were once monitored and traded in real time online, would need to operate on delayed data or return to in-person trading floors. This would make markets more volatile, less predictable, and much harder to manage. Investors would have to rely on physical documents, landline calls, and slower updates, making fast decisions almost impossible. Banking systems would have adapted by now, but it wouldn't be easy. People would no longer check their balances on their phones or transfer money in seconds. Everything would be done at the bank, in person, or by paper. Credit and debit card use would still exist, but would rely on offline systems that are more prone to errors and fraud. Digital banking, once the norm, would become a thing of the past. Culturally, music, movies, and books would go back to physical forms. There would be a rise in bookstores, DVD rentals, and in live music events. Artists would have to find new ways to share their work, and people would begin forming smaller local fan communities instead of global ones. This could actually bring some positives, like more support for local artists or small businesses, but it would also mean fewer people getting discovered on a global scale. Looking forward, rebuilding the internet wouldn't just be a matter of flipping a switch. The loss of infrastructure, the shift in society, and the economic chaos would make it nearly impossible to recreate what we once had. People would be forced to rethink everything. How they connect, how they share, how they live. And maybe in the middle of all this change, the world would ask a new question. Should we even bring the internet back at all? Or would people begin to see this new, slower life as something worth holding on to? That's a question that might not have a clear answer, but it's one the whole world would have to face.